appreciated about the WIT is the wonderful catalyzing of these young minds from around the world who are so impressive and who are tuned into issues of health and environment and are trying to affect change in various countries that they are all from, as well as within inside the United Nations, although that is much more difficult to cause. I'm today to speak on a topic that I know very well, which is on media. And you've had many people who are doctors and scientists and specialists in other companies, in other areas, come and talk to you throughout these sessions on their individual specialties that are so important to finding solutions to problems that are around the world. Well, similarly, I'm today to talk about another solution that is perhaps the most potent, the most powerful, and the most important tool to affect change within countries specifically, which is media. Media as defined as film, media as defined as streaming television, media as defined today as social media, which blends all of these together, film, streaming, and short form content. Inevitably, we started to see pretty significant change recently with people using their Twitter accounts, their social media accounts, their YouTube accounts, their Facebook accounts to create major movements in countries. Of course, all of you will remember that the Arab Spring movements recently all began on Facebook with Facebook posts, Facebook videos, Facebook short films, which catalyzed a whole series of millions of young people into action. But the reality is that this tool and device of media to catalyze millions of people in regions, in continents, and in countries has an origin that goes all the way back to the beginning of the use of media. So let's just briefly talk about that, and then we'll kind of come forward and talk about the power today to influence countries and how media is being used. And Dr. Durbeck, how much time should I leave at the end for any questions, just so I know?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So when we go back in time to the origin of the earliest days of the use of media and film to influence people, you can actually start almost around the same time, which would have been the late 1930s through early 1940s, was really the first time highly impactful media was used. And it was used in, I would say, three ways. One, each country filled movie theaters before a movie would come on with newsreels of the day. And that would be the equivalent of what we now look at as CNN breaking news, Fox News breaking news in movie theaters. And it was played as if it was factual. Of course, at the time, especially in the United States, depending upon what city or state you were in, if you were watching the news of the day and the updates, one of the things you probably wouldn't be asking yourself were questions of who shot this footage, who edited this footage, and who made the decision to create the language that the narrator was using to inform us of what we were looking at. In fact, it was watched no differently than people going into a church on a Sunday listening to a priest, or on a Saturday listening to a rabbi. It was basically told to you as if it was fact. And you would see newsreel footage of various things around the world. Well, in the United States, of course, we would see footage of world events. In Russia, they showed their own footage. In Germany, they showed their own footage. In Japan, they showed their own footage. And of course, none of it was similar. And it was very different, yet all presented factually, so that the local residents in those countries had a very clear sense of what they were supposed to believe was happening in the world at the time. And of course, that created enormous passion and emotion from people watching this. Then we move to the next phase, which is as Hitler was taking power, and as Hitler was growing in his desire to motivate the masses he hired a young filmmaker who was brilliant. Actually, he hired three, but one in particular named Leni Riefenstahl, who was a young German female director who had a very specific signature type of directing. And you have to give Hitler and his Minister of Information at the time, Goebbels, and others around him, he was devious enough to understand the impact that media and newsreels were having on people as propaganda. So what did he do? He hired a woman to make a film called Triumph of the Will. And Triumph of the Will was one of three or four seminal movies that Hitler used to motivate the masses in the late 1930s to have German pride. And of course, in that film, there's a very famous moment where Hitler comes down from the sky being carried on a phoenix and kind of rebirthing the entire German nation and the Fourth Reich, and brings back pride and innocence. At the same time, Leni Riefenstahl and a team of filmmakers were making films like The Rothschilds and something called Jude Seuss, and a handful of movies which were villainizing and dehumanizing the Jewish population primarily, and blaming them for everything that had gone wrong in Germany. And people were watching these films no differently than they were watching the newsreels. And it's very important to point that out, because it's really no different today when we watch a film and we're emotionally connected to it, or we watch something online. We don't question the where does it come from and why is it being made and is there a point to it. So Hitler releases 4 or 5 movies all at once within the span of maybe a year and a half to 2 years. And those films were so impactful. I would say that those films had more impact in helping Germans to become comfortable to dehumanize Jews and dehumanize people who were their neighbors than anything else. Anything else. Because the power of media at that point was showing these things as so factual that people believed it. And they really didn't question what they were watching. In the meantime, right around the same time, the United States had a problem. This is one of Dr. Durback's favorite stories that I tell, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a problem in the United States, which was more people were focused on, of course, what was going on in the West, towards Japan and in the Pacific front, than they were, and they cared more than what was going on the Eastern front. And they really genuinely had a problem, because in the United States, there was a political party that actually supported Germany. And there were many, many people who were big proponents and big celebrities in the United States at the time who were flying back and forth to Germany, being hosted by Hitler and many of his people. And there were many people in the United States. There was an equivalent of what we now know today as people like in the United States, Rush Limbaugh and other people who were on radio, a guy named Father Coughlin, and who was a very big radio host, and people like Charles Lindbergh, who was an American patriot, who all supported Germany at the time. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a problem. He had a problem, which is how do we motivate the United States into a war to support and go against Germany and take on the Nazis. And so he picked up the phone, recognizing, again, he had a series of people around him that were very media savvy. And they picked up the phone and called 2 brothers who lived in Burbank, California. And they were the Warner Brothers, now known as Warner Brothers Films. A good example of Warner Brothers Films, if you don't know it, is they're about to release Wonder Woman, coming out in about a week. You have a situation where sorry, someone's trying to break into my call right now, and I want to get rid of them really quickly. Okay. You have a situation where FDR had to figure out a way to motivate masses, and Warner Brothers come up and send him 2 young writers named Philip and Julius Epstein, send them to Washington, D.C. 2 young Jewish writers come in, they sit down with the inner cabinet of FDR, they sit down with FDR himself, and they say, we've come up with a story. And FDR's first words were, well, tell me, is it a big, war adventure? Is it major ships? Is it a big battle film? What is it? And they said, no, it's a love story. It's a love story. And everybody shook their head and said, what do you mean it's a love story? They said, it's a love story. If you want to get people extremely angry and motivated to hate something, make a love story and then make it so that at the end of the movie, the two people who you've fallen in love with, who fall in love with each other, can't be with each other. Because then you'll hate the people who are doing that to them. So, of course, the Epsteins went off and they wrote the movie Casablanca, which went on to become a huge, huge, huge scene film. And in fact, the United States government subsidized the film itself and subsidized the release of the film. And I think in today's terms, meaning if you applied how many people saw the film back then who could have on a proportional basis to how many people and how many people paid to see it back then, it would have been at the same level of Titanic or Avatar or a Marvel movie like Avengers today. It would have been that big because it played in every single cinema that was available at the time in every single city in the United States, which is a rarity, and played pretty much around the clock. So that was an example of kind of how do you motivate people, how do you use media. Let's jump ahead a bit because clearly media in countries around the world has been something that's kind of an unknown, right? Today, for example, you think of Kazakhstan and it's like the inverse, right? Sacha Baron Cohen has so definitively branded Kazakhstan as an idiot nation with his Borat series that that's going to be a very hard thing for them to climb out of as a tourist destination or as a place that people are going to want to go, oh, I'm going to want to go live in Kazakhstan. And yet I've been working with Kazakhstan, very frustrating actually, because they actually can't get out of their own way. There's actually a lot of truth to what what he captured. There are certain countries today that are very successfully, I want to jump to media now, that have never had a media industry. And they're very new to it. And they're recognizing that media is an incredible way to introduce the world to the power of their history, their culture, their themes, their narrative. It helps them it helps them to grow trade. It helps them to wake people up to the fact that this is a country that should be accepted and brought into first world kind of understanding of collegiality amongst countries. And there's many countries today that are waking up to saying we need to use media to bridge that gap. And I'll just give some examples of countries that over time went from totally kind of an unknown destination to known destination that have been heavily influenced by media and have their entire culture today is somewhat defined by their media industry. Probably the best example of that, of course, is New Zealand. And you know, New Zealand, I would say in the late 1980s, was a heavily unknown country. It was an unknown country here. It was an unknown tourist destination. I think at the time they had a few $1,000,000 a year of tourism. It was not a place of trade. It was not a place where people really focused on it. And we had the honor in 1995 in starting to negotiate with the government, a guy named Trevor Mallard and Helen Clark is very involved with the United Nations now. And through the advent of the film The Lord of the Rings, we were able to basically build an entire economy in New Zealand that became a multi-$100 million a year economy, both in tourism and manufacturing, and built a base. And that led, of course, to 6 major films, billions of dollars, and then followed up by the Narnia films, which were shot there, and many others. So that's an example of a country which today, to a T, everybody looks at as, I can't wait to move to New Zealand. It's like considered up here as magical. People can't separate really. Poor Ireland, you know, before New Zealand made The Lord of the Rings, Ireland was considered the fairy magical place of the world. Now it's not. And, you know, New Zealand has scooped that space. Everybody wants to move to New Zealand. Everybody wants to live there because it's magical. You know, quality of life is incredible. And more people know things about New Zealand. And when you go to New Zealand as a tourist, of course, you have to visit the film locations. You visit the Hobbit set, you visit Lord of the Rings, and the country is almost intertwined with its media space. I would say that Croatia is a country which has done an incredible job doing the same thing. The Czech Republic has built a very viable media business, which has done a wonderful job building a very solid base. Estonia and Latvia are two countries which we've worked in very closely that have built vibrant billion-dollar media businesses. And people today look at both Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to that degree as very safe, comfortable countries to go visit, work in, move to. Portugal is another country that kind of before never really had a media business, but now has a very vibrant media business and is growing. Interestingly enough, I would say that it's not going to be government that's going to solve government intervention from the United States, Saudi Arabia, or the UAE, ultimately, that will solve the Palestinian Israeli differences and peace issues. It's going to be media that's going to help. And it's happening now all the time. There are joint initiatives of TV series, joint initiatives of film series, joint initiatives of streaming series that are happening between Israelis and Palestinians all over the place right now. There's never been such a vibrant sector of creating new projects. And by the way, these are projects that are number 1, 2, and 3 on Amazon, Apple, Netflix right now, that are joint collaborations between Palestinians and Israelis working together to tell very balanced stories about, the Mossad, about the Palestinian Authority, and just bringing attention to the fact that there are good people on both sides. There's humanity that exists on both sides, and kind of taking away the sting of the dehumanization that oftentimes exists out of ignorance that media here is being used to help and to promote. So I don't know if I've run out of time, by the way. No, I still have time.
No, you still have 20 more minutes.
Okay, great. So I want to talk about how short form media is being used both positively and negatively right now as well. Because short form media today, you have, and I was talking to Miriam about this almost 2 months ago. You have today a whole new generation of celebrities that are not Tom Cruise, Julia Roberts, and Leonardo DiCaprio. These are celebrities that have come out of social media user-generated forums like TikTok, Reels, Instagram, YouTube, and Instagram and IGTV, as well as Baidu and many other, WeChat and other forums. These celebrities are of this new generation that you're all part of. These celebrities have a lot of power. These celebrities can make a 60-second video that's a 3-act structure, a 60-second video that gets seen by 1.2 billion people in the span of a week. So the power today of media has changed dramatically from where we were with Casablanca, where we were with Triumph of the Will, to today being able to have impact. The question is, how do these videos today impact people? Which ones are working? Which ones are sustainable? Which ones are creating movements? Which ones are having people follow behind and growing into kind of a mission, into a movement of kind of media leading into change? So today, there's a whole handful, for example, of incredible online personalities who have focused their energy into smaller island nations and the preservation, for example, of coral reefs. And their attention has been almost universally using their personas, using their audience space to bring attention to coral reefs in small little countries. Even Dr. Durback recently was traveling in the Pacific and got to meet some of the coral reef people that some of these people have funded. And right now, for example, you have certain areas of Hawaii where the governor of Hawaii has literally granted something like 40 acres of coastline to these social media figures, and literally just gave it to them. Now, what's interesting is there's this huge moment in time right now where you have all of these celebrity figures who have great passion and they mean to do well. They really do. They mean to bring great attention to these things. And this is a good example where you have a group of people who are given major opportunity to do something positive. They are aligned with certain nonprofits, but they're not equipped to take that leadership role now to the next level. They're not equipped to, how do I use the power of the fact that I was just given 40 acres of pristine coastline in Hawaii along these coral reefs to make a change? How do I do this in a different way? So there's great opportunity right now that's out there that groups like the WIT and you, the interns of the WIT and members of the WIT, can really be helpful, because we have to connect. I think that's one of the things that has to happen. There has to be a connection, to these things. There's a former WIT intern who worked at the WIT for many years, who's worked at the WIT for a whole summer and then has stayed involved for many years, whose work has actually been seminal in creating attention to multiple movements around the world through her use of shooting documentaries and short form documentaries. And that's Jade Sacker, who has gone out into the world, and she used to just do photographs and video of rare groups around the world. But it was Jade's work specifically where she embedded for 6 months with the Communist Women's Army of Syria that drew great attention to the work that was being done by this women's army in Syria, which led, of course, to people seeing that and then making a very successful TV series, which is on Hulu today, which is their #1 TV series. And now all of a sudden, you have thousands and thousands of people aware of what's going on, aware of this group, contributions going to this group, and a whole movement behind this group. So it shows you the power and the linear nature of how media led to multiple more examples. Right now, Jade is involved, by the way, with a fascinating documentary that she's involved with making of 2 brothers who were both orphans that were twins, and they both ended up in a family in Utah. They were African American gentlemen. One went on to become the leader of Black Lives Matter and the militant group of Black Lives Matter inside, and one went on to become the leader, ironically, of, on the opposite side, a total splinter group on the Republican conservative side in a military way. And she's been following both stories now as a documentary, which is a very impactful look at so many things that are going on inside the United States right now, as told from the story of two brothers. So I want to go back a second to social media, because social media can be used and abused as well. And so a good example of that is, of course, you had a reporter from the Washington Post that was killed by members of whatever they were from Saudi Arabia. Who knows what the real story was behind that? I'm not here to posit anything. And of course, Saudi Arabia found itself heavily under the microscope of the world for what went down and for that horrible murder. Someone inside of Saudi Arabia came up with an idea, because travel and tourism started to go down, events were being canceled, and issues started to happen. So someone inside of Saudi Arabia came up with a great idea, and they said, well, what if we held a series of big events? That would be a very positive thing. So of course they paid for, which is a lot of countries do that. They pay for things like Formula One races. They pay for Formula E, or they'll pay for the G7 to be held in their country or whatever. And those used to be the big impactful things that got world attention and importance. Well, that didn't work. So then they realized, well, what else can we do? And of course, they paid for 60 of the biggest TikTok, YouTube, Instagram celebrities out there to come to their country, all expense paid for a week. And the only condition was they had to post again and again and again short films all about the country and their experiences traveling all over Saudi Arabia. Well, that generated, of course, billions and billions and billions of views, and brought great attention to Saudi Arabia in a positive way. It also had negative, because there was a backlash. It was the first time that the social community finally, in my opinion, it was a real tipping point. It was really the first time the social community out there took a very proactive stance and said, wait a second, why are these major celebrities running around Saudi Arabia looking like they're having so much fun? What's going on? What's happening right now? And it created a very, very big backlash where suddenly a bunch of the people who were actually in Saudi Arabia at the time actually left. Interestingly enough, Dubai wasted no time and basically took out its checkbook and immediately took advantage of all those people, brought them over to Dubai and shot a very similar campaign of travel and tourism and stories and whatnot. And it, totally increased, what was happening in the country. So I'm going to flip over a second to a different example, which is Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a country which has no media business, has very few filmmakers, and they're at the very early stage right now of deciding, under Ortega and others, how do we basically build attention to this country? How do we enter the world for trade? How do we get people to look at us? We just got destroyed by several hurricanes in a row, and our country very much needs help. And so they've reached out now to us and others to say, how can we work together to build a media business in film, streaming, as well as build a user-generated media business? And so that's where their focus and attention is now, which is how do they start that and how do they jumpstart that? Another country that we're just now having conversations with that we're still quite skeptical about, but that has come to us to say they're very serious. They would like to try and build a media business, bring attention, create stories, narrative, show parts of their geography for tourism, whatever, is Uzbekistan. And here you have a country which has some of the most pristine historical sites along the Silk Road that are still intact. You have incredible access to the country. The country was run by one singular figure, of course, for many, 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 many years, and now seems to be again. But for the first time, Uzbekistan is realizing that they need to do more on media to create trade, create opportunity, connect their country to the rest of the world. And so their focus similarly is how do we use media to join the rest of the world? It's been a unique challenge for us looking at the country and figuring that out. We're doing a similar program right now in Vietnam, trying to figure out how to help Vietnam basically build. Now, Vietnam is different than Uzbekistan because in Vietnam, you have probably more people do things on their phones on a population basis in Vietnam and stream content in Vietnam on their phones than in the United States on a percentage basis. And more people in Vietnam are used to and have grown up in a very young demographic, yet they have no media business to speak of that's a consistent, sustainable media business. And the government's very confused there about the messaging it wants to send out about the country, about its values and principles. So there, it's a very interesting opportunity. It's almost like the Arab Spring, only very quiet, because what's happening there over time, very slowly, is the youth of Vietnam are using media in shorts, film, and whatnot within the country to create a very slow and steady rise of attention. And I'll end this part of the speech by talking specifically about a country that we have not agreed to take on as a client or work with yet, but that I find fascinating as a study of media because they've never quite gotten it right. I always ask people jokingly, can you name the 3 biggest film and television producers in the world? What countries are the 3 biggest film and media producers in the world? And everybody always says, well, China definitely, the United States definitely, and probably, India. And yes, India would be number 1. There's more content made in India regionally and nationally than any other country in the world on a daily basis, weekly basis, yearly basis, by far. They've had a horrible time exporting it outside the country, but they do make an enormous amount of content within inside the country. And that's a way that people actually learn about other regions within inside of India. The United States would be number 2 in terms of the amount of content that we're creating. And China is actually number 5. It's not number 3. So when I tell people the 3rd country on the list, they're always surprised, and it's Nigeria. And Nigeria produces more content then Russia, then China, then France, then Italy, then Canada. Pretty much then, if you combined all the countries of Latin America together, you would still not have what Nigeria does in a year. And Nigeria, just like we have what's called Hollywood in the United States, and in India, it's called Bollywood, and in India, it's called, in Nigeria, it's called Nollywood. And the problem that Nigeria has, and it's finally making the turn, problem that Nigeria has had has been that the stories that they're telling are the equivalent of saying, what if we made the same Sylvester Stallone movie over and over and over and over again, only with different people, and that's the only story we told. The reality is that Nigeria actually has very talented filmmakers. They have very talented actors, and they have a vibrant community there. They just need to be able to tell more accessible stories, human interest stories, and stories that combine their culture with outsiders to be able to create more access into their world. And for the first time ever, you have Nigerian filmmakers who are finally and bravely telling stories of the young school kids who were taken by Boko Haram. You finally have stories of filmmakers telling the trials and travails of whole regions of the country that the government gave up on. And now the government's taking notice, and now people are taking notice, and they're winning festivals, and they're going out and bringing attention. Now, there hasn't been a great Nigerian movie yet that has transferred over to a must-see on Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Hulu yet, but it's coming, and they will get there. And once they make that tipping point move, where they start to create that accessible, watch out, you are going to see more content coming out of that country again and again and again. And then suddenly Nigeria will be a very important country around the world to talk about. And that ends my speech.
Thank you, Cary, for a fascinating history of the effect of media on the world. And my question, the first question I would like to ask you is, to what extent are different countries using media for the improvement of their situations and improvement of their governments? And what countries actually focus on the governance itself rather than just, as you say, the Stallone movies?
Well, I think if I can answer the question a little bit differently, I would say that China and Russia do an enormous amount of media specifically focused on government initiatives that they want to get better public support for, both in documentaries and in narrative films. There's no countries that do that better than they do, by far, especially China. So you will have major projects being made in China that will focus on, sometimes as a documentary or as a narrative piece, focus on a Chinese-funded project to build a major port in another country or even in its own country, or about its own military. And so China owns a very large state-owned group out of Beijing, one of the Beijing 25, called Poly, P-O-L-Y. Poly, which is the largest maker of warships and military, also happens to have a subsidiary called Polyculture. And Polyculture is their film arm and has movie theaters and makes films and, you know, fulfills that, you know, piece for them very successfully, very successfully. It would be like the equivalent of saying, you know, what if Lockheed Martin in the United States was owned by, you know, or, you know, one of the major military makers in the United States was owned by the U.S. government. Oh, and also had a film subsidiary, you know, and made films. So it's pretty fascinating. There are also examples of countries run by, you know, North Korea has probably emulated to a T in its film industry and TV industry what Hitler was doing in the 1930s, right? I mean, the films they make inside of North Korea are are so propaganda oriented about the rest of the world to support its own, government.
What about, I do not understand. Leon is not sending me any questions, which I'm sure that there's loads of them. But my question to you, what about the expansion of the media in Africa besides Nigeria?
Well, we're deciding right now if we're going to take on Morocco as an example, which I think is a wonderful country. There's a good example of a government that basically came out and said, tell us what we need to do. Tell us how we can bring in more tourism, bring in more, trade, increase the number of countries. So that's one example. Liberia is...
Morocco, I think a lot of people are aware of it. They have expanded and the new king is doing a wonderful job. I'm talking about more of the countries.
Well, let me talk about Liberia.
Yes.
Talk about Liberia. So Liberia has now made an investment into media for the first time ever, and wants to tell more of a fair and balanced history to Charles Taylor, to some of the women that were military leaders and generals in the country, through their tumultuous period of time through today, and wants to use media to really grow it's the attention to the country. So that's a big initiative that's going on right now in Liberia with major money behind it. Cameroon has recently set aside money to start to build the film industry, but they don't know what they want to do with it. I mean, obviously South Africa has had a very prominent, film industry for years and years and years. Kenya has suffered its own. Richard's raising his hand. I think he might have a question, by the way.
I do. Well, you finish your statement.
So
yes.
Kenya and Zimbabwe have recently struggled to kind of figure out how to, building a media business requires a bunch of things. It requires, in any country, identifying, most importantly, a group of people that are dedicated to sticking with something to help support and grow a program. So let's start with that. You need a dedicated group of people that will help to lead an initiative. It can't be done just by outsiders. Number two, it needs talent, and it needs to have that talent supported, whether that talent are directors, writers, actors, and it needs that talent to feel comfortable to be able to make things. It needs funding to be able to grow, and then most importantly, it needs technology, whether that technology is Wi-Fi, whether that technology is equipment, to be able to make, post-produce, and then to be able to figure out where you're going to put the material on air. How do you air it somewhere? Is it a film? Is it a series? Where do you put it? Kazakhstan, unfortunately, gave people an enormous amount of money to support talent, gave people an enormous amount of equipment, although old equipment, and where Kazakhstan failed again and again and again is every time people would start making things, they had a group of people from the top of the country and the Minister of Culture, who in my opinion, I hope it's being taped, is an idiot, who basically refused to allow things to finish unless they got paid. So that was just a country of corruption where they just wouldn't. So you have hundreds of projects that actually are partially made in Kazakhstan that will never see the light of day because the government won't allow it. Kenya, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, obviously, we talked about a second ago, is trying to take the lead. Then you have countries like, smaller countries like Ghana and others that are going to start to, I think, make a move now and start to grow their media industry. And each one is wonderful because they have hundreds, if not thousands of years of history, mythology, themes, culture that have never been told, and stories that the world would love to hear that no one has been able to connect with.
Thank you. That's a very excellent presentation. Now, Richard, what was the question that you asked?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say to Cary that was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for that. Sure. And I struggle with I'm a climate change advisor, educator, and I struggle with dealing with the ideological divide, especially as it relates to news outlets. And I was wondering if you had any good suggestions for how to bridge that divide.
Well, I think that the good news about that is it's 100% been solved without anybody purposefully solving it. It's been solved for us. Because whereas before you could count on CNN or MSNBC being your allies, Richard, for inconvenient truth, and on Fox and all of the conservative Sinclair channels and all of the conservative channels, whether it's Newsmax oriented or OWN, playing their version of inconvenient truth, which is the opposite version of perhaps the point of view with whatever documentaries and stories they're going to tell, telling why climate change isn't real and all of these, various points of view. The great equalizer today is the social media platforms, being TikTok, Reels, Instagram, YouTube, the ones where today, fortunately, there hasn't been any sort of political weight one way or another. So you could be watching TikTok and you could literally go through something that's very conservative oriented. Suddenly you're going to get to something that's very, much focused on climate change, and you'll see something on Greta that comes up, and then on the other side, and you can harness it and focus it which way you want. But what's great today about TikTok, and even though it's owned, yes, by the Chinese and all these other things, but what's great today about those social media platforms is at any given time, there's probably thousands of real-time live programs streaming. You just have to know how to find it. And so it's become the new marketplace of ideas. And so if I were trying to create attention to a specific point within inside of environmental issues, I'd certainly want to start there. And I'd want to focus on how do I reach the greatest number of people, and then make sure I'm consistent with following it up. Because more people have seen Alexis Risen or any of these recent YouTube, TikTok people who have made things on climate change than anything else ever made before it. I mean, in the billions. And so there's great power to that. And I don't think today you're going to find, I think you'll see a dramatic change, Richard, with Fox News coming up. I do know for a fact that Fox News is going to go back to the day and age when it wasn't just Sean Hannity at 8 p.m., but it used to be called Hannity and Alan Combs. So I think you're going to see Fox pivot very, very strong. I know for a fact they are, because they're out there looking for content right now that genuinely represents both sides. Fox wants to actually jump into the fray to become the central channel. And they really want to make that pivot very strongly, which I think is smart.
In other words, Fox wants to basically merge their own perspective with the CNN?
I mean, let's be very clear. CNN's perspective was very middle ground. If you want to look at it from a political standpoint, up until 2.5 years ago, CNN would have been the point of view of what you'd consider in the Senate as the Gang of Eight.
Yes.
It basically represented the central position of, between where John McCain stood and Joe Lieberman and Michael Bennet and, the Gang of Eight senators that represented the middle of the country's point of view. Not middle of the country, literally, but the middle point of view of the country.
Yeah.
CNN under Jeff Zucker took a very hardline stance, not necessarily against Republican issues or even so much conservative issues, just against Trump. So I think it just became the anti-Trump network, as did it was too easy, too much low-hanging fruit, and they used it to bolster their ratings. But when you actually look back at some of the things that are there, it's not, when you look at it on a traditional basis, right? In that sense, one of my heroes growing up was Pat Moynihan, right? Senator Pat Moynihan.
Yes.
CNN would have attacked Pat Moynihan with their news because he would have been too conservative and too aggressive in the way he thinks. I I think what happened over the last 2.5 years was the networks became personality cults, not necessarily political party, pundits. They became more personality cults of Trump and anti-Trump, right? So, but I think it's going to be more balanced coming forward, and I think you're going to have way more channels. I also think, Richard, that the streaming channels themselves, Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, Hulu, HBO Max, Peacock from NBC Universal, Paramount TV, which is about to come out, in a major way, and some of the others will take the place of kind of Fox News and others, because people love watching documentaries now. I mean, it's a huge business on Netflix and Amazon and Hulu. So today, if Inconvenient Truth were made again, we had a conversation with Lawrence Bender about this, that if it was all done all over again today, it would just premiere on Netflix and it would be seen by, 100 million people day one, which is great. It's a wonderful thing, and it's a great way to get, things seen.
When's your next documentary coming out?
That's a good question.
While you're thinking of an answer, my question would be, to what extent would media like Facebook and TikTok and all the other medias that we have, to what extent do you think that they influence the thinking of the public?
Again, I think up until and through the election, greatly. And I think what's happened now is there's been a period of time that no one wants to admit, but we're in it now, literally right now. We're in a very interesting period a very interesting moment right now of what I would call and deem pure mental exhaustion. Mm-hmm. And I think that period of mental exhaustion that we're in is really confusing to people. It's great for psychologists. It's great for the psychiatric industry. But this period of mental exhaustion that we're in is when you're living in tension and crisis and anxiety and fighting for so long for different pieces, and then it's over. And forget about what Trump's doing with trying to overturn the election. And he's only doing that to raise money for his media company, which he successfully has done brilliantly, I have to say. He's raised close to $200 million of people who think they're giving donations to his turn the election around campaign, and they don't read the fine print, which is clearly all about, the fact that 75% of the money can be used for future initiatives, which he has a whole plan for, media plan for. We're in a place that no one quite has an answer as to what kind of content they want to watch. Interestingly enough, I've talked to people at Amazon, Netflix, and the major streamers, and there's a very confusing period of time right now where what used to be reliably as number one, number two, number three as new releases isn't anymore. And that's because people during this period of time sought out content as a release. Standpoint of it's forced a reevaluation in hundreds of millions of people to figure out what they want. And I think it's a really interesting thing, because what's happening right now that Netflix and these guys didn't see is, rather than people watching a lot of new content, there's an enormous amount of things going on where people are searching for historical content, going back to say, what was that movie in the 70s that was about this or that? Or my favorite example being, one of my favorite films that people are watching again and again and again today is the great Hal Ashby film, Harold and Maude. And people are going to basically start watching that because it's all about, in the darkest of moments, how do I love life and find meaning in life? So I think there's a unique moment right now. Of course, Dr. Durbeck, you'll be the first to acknowledge that the fear of this moment, of course, is the artificial kind of prophets that will pop up in different ways to try and lead people out of this morass that won't be qualified to do so, but I think there's a great opportunity for media right now to do some wonderful soul-searching type content, which will have a great impact for countries and leaders. That's all I'll answer.
Well, thank you. That's hopefully this is going to galvanize a lot of thinking, which unfortunately I think most people do not engage themselves in critical thinking about what's going on and how it's going to affect their life in the future. But there is a question from Mariam. To what extent can you tell us more about the technology of the global influence for the young generation, particularly teenagers and your own project? This question is from Mariam.
So, I mean, I think, look, let me just deal with technology a second. We don't realize that when I'll give you a good example. I'm sure many people have traveled to China, and when you travel to China and you try and go on YouTube or use your Gmail or use certain apps and programs, you can't. And that's because China as a country prohibits certain technologies and certain streaming technologies and wireless technologies from being used. If you can apply that to Russia and you apply that to other countries, it exists in a lot of places. In our country, we've never had that tipping point moment where technology was going to be challenged by our own government. And Donald Trump came closest to anybody, any leader in the last 100 years. And I know we've all talked about, oh, there's going to be a civil war if Trump loses, if Trump wins. The only time I've ever thought that there would actually be a real civil war of people going to the streets and genuinely rioting was if Donald Trump stupidly was to cancel TikTok in the United States over his war with China. And I have never seen more people on a platform ready to go to war. And I'm not kidding when I say ready to go to war. I'm talking about teenager. No one's going to take that from me. It's like telling a teenager, let me have your phone. You're going to have a timeout. Let me have your phone. And, you're basically, and in the United States, the closest we've ever come to that was that. This notion that Donald Trump and, Wilbur, I loved watching these TikTok videos, forgive my language, but with all of these 16 and 17-year-olds going, who the F is Wilbur Ross? And why does he think he has any right to take away my TikTok? I'm on TikTok 5 hours a day, not me, but people are on TikTok on average 3 to 5 hours a day. And here we are with these old men sitting in Washington saying they're going to cancel TikTok. What? That was going to be, if he had done that, we would have had our Arab Spring like that, just like that. You would have had, forget about Occupy Wall Street, forget about, these movements would have been nothing. If they had canceled TikTok, you would have had a movement that would have literally, talk about a 1 million man march in Washington, D.C. You would have 10 million people in Washington, D.C. overnight.
You're talking about the youth.
Yes.
So, yeah, because actually I do not think anybody over 30 or 40 would really go to war over TikTok.
Yeah,
but it's amazing.
Yeah, but the 16 to 30-year-olds would have.
It's possible, but keep in mind the 16-year-olds to the 21-year-olds are the ones that are the fearless. They are the ones that do not mind the changes. Remember your own life, 16 to 21 years old.
Yeah, but Dr. Jerbeck, the point is, you're right, they're fearless, but there's very few things people can point to say, I'm part of the generation that built this. And not since the early 1980s, when people, quote unquote, built MTV as a culture and as a worldwide phenomenon connecting culture, right? There's only been a few counterculture movements that people felt were theirs. Yeah, the Rolling Stone magazine in the 60s with P.G. O'Rourke in the early days being a voice of that counterculture. Yeah. You had MTV in the 1980s. I want my MTV was their slogan, which stood for I want my independence and no one will take it from me. Now you have TikTok. And TikTok represents the pure and ultimate freedom to express whatever you want, whenever you want. And all it takes is a phone and a little thing to upload in 13 seconds. And if someone was going to take that away from them, believe me, believe me, that would have, I was so fascinated watching that. I was like, oh my, no one's covering the impact of this. And it was a vacuous threat. I don't think the Trump administration ever intended to do that. I think they were toying with the wrong thing. And it quickly went away thanks to people like Larry Ellison and Walmart.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's just a fascinating perspective of how you can get a movement that is least expected. It's like Tiananmen Square, in my opinion. That's what you're saying. That basically, that's TikTok would be a reaction like happened in Tiananmen Square, which still affected the world completely. Well, all I can say is, Cary, thank you very, very much for a brilliant presentation, which of course I expected. And we are very grateful, and we had an awful lot of people listening, but I didn't really want to interfere with too many questions, because I felt that what you offer to our audience is much more important.
So I'm gonna end with one challenge, if I may, because there's many.
Okay.
I hope there's many of your current interns and youth group people currently watching.
They do. They are. I have pictures of many of them right here.
So here's my challenge. My challenge to everybody watching who are part of that next generation is this. The WIT publishes some of the most incredible articles in its periodicals that are so informative, groundbreaking, changing, life-affirming, and important.